This week we're going to talk about operant conditioning. Now this is B.F. Skinner's theory. B.F. Skinner was one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century. He created the theory of operant conditioning. Now this is different from classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, two things are paired together. An unconditioned stimulus is paired with a stimulus that starts out as neutral and becomes conditioned. But in operant conditioning, first you emit a behavior, and then that behavior has a consequence, and that consequence changes the frequency of that behavior. So if the behavior is reinforced, it increases in frequency. If the behavior is punished, it decreases in frequency. So there's four types of consequences that you can have for a behavior. The consequence can be positive in that something is added to the situation. The consequence can be negative, something gets removed. And the result can be one of two things. Reinforcement increases behavior and punishment decreases behavior. Now, the way Skinner used these words, reinforcement and punishment, it's not necessarily the way we think about it. It's judged just by what happens to the behavior. So something that's reinforcing for one person, you may have a favorite food, and you'll work and increase certain behaviors if they result in getting that favorite food. For someone else, they might not like that food. It might not be reinforcing. And the same thing with punishment. Punishment is not necessarily what we conventionally think of as punishment. Punishment is anything that decreases the frequency of a behavior. So let's look at the four combinations. You can have positive reinforcement. You get something and it makes, as a result, following a behavior, you get something and it makes that behavior more likely. So a lot of us, or all of us, have probably seen a child screaming in the checkout line of a grocery store, and the parent, to quiet the child down, gives him or her candy. Well, that child's more likely to scream, especially in the checkout line of a grocery store, because in that setting she knows that she'll get rewarded with candy, and then she will stop screaming. Which brings us to the next box, negative reinforcement. The parent was negatively reinforced because the screaming is aversive, hurts your ears, it's embarrassing, and as soon as you give the child candy, the screaming lets up. So the parent has just been reinforced for giving candy to a screaming child and is more likely to do it the next time the child screams. And another example here, your neighbors are having a noisy party, you call the police, the noise stops. Next time there's a noisy party, you'll be more likely to call the police. Okay, now let's look at the punishment boxes. Positive punishment means something is added to the situation and it decreases the behavior. So child gets spanked when he swears, he's less likely to swear in the future. Not that I'm advocating spanking. Negative punishment, something is removed and it decreases behavior. So a classic example of this is employee discipline. You're looking at inappropriate sites on the internet at work. Your employer suspends you for a few days without pay. Something has been taken away, your pay, and your behavior as a result decreases. You'll stay off the inappropriate sites. Okay, now schedules of reinforcement are another aspect of reinforcement. They can be fixed, variable, or continuous. So you can get rewarded after a certain fixed number of responses. After an average but variable number of responses, maybe on average you get rewarded after 10 responses, but it could be 5, it could be 15. Or you can have a continuous reward schedule where you get rewarded after every response. And it can be interval, where it's number of responses, or it can be ratio, where it's a certain fixed amount of time. So let's look at each of these 5 possibilities. Generally, at most jobs, you get a paycheck on a fixed schedule. You get the same amount every time, so that would be considered a fixed interval schedule. On these schedules, your rate of response is highest before you get reinforced. It goes down after reinforcement. You might think of that when you're studying for a test. You're studying behavior goes up right before the test and then drops off afterwards. Variable interval. The boss pokes his head in your office at random times. So, and if you're doing work, being productive, you get rewarded for when he pokes his head in. So that's a variable interval schedule. Fixed ratio, work on a piecemeal, you assemble so many widgets, and you get paid per widget. So that is a fixed ratio schedule. That encourages steady responding. Generally, on a fixed ratio schedule, you're going to respond on a pretty consistent basis and keep up about the same pace. Variable ratio schedule, a classic example of that is a slot machine. You might put in 10 quarters, you might put in 2 quarters. It varies how long you have to go before you get reinforced. If you do commission sales, that's also a variable ratio. And the thing about variable ratio scales, they develop high response rates and slow extinction rates. So you can see how gambling or a gambling addiction can quickly develop, because people are throwing those quarters or dollars into the slot machine, and even if they don't get a return for a long time, they'll keep doing it. Eventually it gets extinguished if they don't get any payout, but they're going to keep doing it for quite a while. Continuous reinforcement schedule, you quickly acquire the behavior, but you also quickly lose it. It's quickly extinguished as soon as the continuous reinforcement stops. Now, operant conditioning is a tremendously useful theory. It can explain many kinds of normal and abnormal behavior. It even applies to verbal behavior. The way we speak and the situations that we say certain things in can be explained by reinforcement and punishment. Personality development. Antisocial personalities, they've learned that when they're aggressive or harm other people in some way, they get what they want. So a lot of times, if you look at a combination of biology and environment, you can understand how things develop. So antisocial person may have antisocial parents, may have antisocial predisposition, be born with an aggressive sort of attitude, and then if you're in, that person is in situations where antisocial behavior is reinforced, they develop an antisocial personality. So many kinds of psychopathology can be explained with operant conditioning. We mentioned addictions. Depression can be explained as a low rate of reinforcement. If you don't have the skills to get reinforcement, say socially, it's likely you'll fall into a depression because of a low rate of reinforcement. And as I mentioned, personality disorders can be explained by operant conditioning. And the great thing about operant conditioning is If you can explain it with operant conditioning, you can also cure it or modify behavior with operant conditioning. So this is what behavior analysts do. You can reduce abnormal or problematic behavior. You can teach skills or improve skills, and you can eliminate bad habits. So the theory of operant conditioning has tremendous and broad applicability.